Waiting in long lines to buy food might not be what you'd expect to see in one of the world's biggest oil-producing nations. But this is now an increasingly common sight in Venezuela. When economists talk about the rate of inflation or the devaluation of a currency, it can all seem very academic, removed from the realities of everyday life. But here in Caracas, this is the reality. People lining up at the supermarket to buy basic things like rice, butter and flour. Those are the real effects of an ailing economy. And there's no guarantee that shoppers will find what they need. Coromoto Silva tells us she often has to go without things like bread, sugar and rice, all vital ingredients to feed a family. And this isn't the first time this working mother has faced food shortages.
It's stressful when I go shopping because often I return empty-handed. I'm buying basic food and I have to go to the supermarket every day to check if they have anything. It's really not easy for me, and my children are studying and working, so they can't help.
Venezuela has one of the highest rates of inflation in the world, and some blame government price control of food for the current crisis. But Hugo Chávez's Socialist Party says it's the private sector that's hoarding food and being greedy. That's an excuse analyst Luis Vicente Leon says will only last so long.
For the very first 2 or 3 months, it works for them, and the people is angry at the private sector. But they have to solve the problem, otherwise they are going to be the guilty one at the very end.
For the Silvas then and millions of other Venezuelans, there's no immediate relief in sight. Just the prospect that every time they go to the supermarket, they may return empty-handed. Andy Gallagher, Al Jazeera, Caracas, Venezuela.
Government supporters answered the call to commemorate one of Venezuela's darkest days. 24 years ago, on this same day, scores of Venezuelans descended from the hillside slums of Caracas, burning cars and looting to protest a hike in gasoline prices, the last straw in a series of austerity measures. What followed was the worst massacre in Venezuela's history. The bodies fell on my front door and blood flowed everywhere, remembers Carmen Vasquez, a street vendor. Like most here, she believes that today's situation is very different, that the Chávez government does provide a social cushion. But she concedes that this month's sharp devaluation of Venezuela's currency is bad news.
In an economy where a very high percentage of goods are imported, the devaluation will be highly inflationary, especially food and medicine, which impacts the poor the most.
Indeed, at the market, something smells fishy. Prices have been going up steadily. The black market price of the dollar, which many use to gauge prices, still 4 times the official value, even after the devaluation.
I used to pay 20 or 25 bolivars per pair and sell them for 100 before December. But since President Chávez became ill, the prices kept rising. Now they cost over 130 a pair. The dollar went out of control when he got sick.
The uncertainty about Venezuela's political future is not helping. But regardless, the economy was ill and needed urgent medicine, concedes Socialist Deputy Ricardo Sanguino.
We can't continue to provide goods and services without getting something back, without covering the cost of providing it. We need a better balance between expenditure and income.
Even the politically charged option of raising the price of gasoline, which in Venezuela is practically free, is being discussed.
Venezuela's government knew that it could wait no longer to try to put its finances in order. But the timing could not have been worse. President Chávez has not been seen or heard in public now for nearly 3 months. And people are now beginning to openly talk about new elections being called any day now.
Authorities have been closing and fining stores to prevent illegal price hikes. But Venezuela's political uncertainty, which has a destabilizing economic impact, is proving to be much harder to control. Lucia Newman, Al Jazeera, Caracas.
Well, Edward Schumacher Matos is a Latin America expert and professor at Columbia Journalism School and joins us live from New York. Nicolas Maduro has stepped up as interim leader. He has some massive shoes to fill. Can he do it?
Well, he's no Chavez. I mean, you can't have Chavismo without Chavez, but he'll have a tremendous amount of sympathy support, at least for a while.
So you think he's going to win these elections, but then is he going to be able to continue on Chávez's legacy?
That's a great question. I mean, if the elections are quick, you know, he's favored to win. He should win. And they're supposed to be called within 30 days. But if for some reason it gets drawn out longer than that, then you'll begin to see fractures in Chávez's own party. And Maduro is not a sure bet to continue to lead it.
But what sort of
There's a guy who's head of the General Assembly, a fellow named Diosdado Cabello, who was a former military guy like Chávez, and in some ways he's more charismatic than Maduro, and he could challenge Maduro for leadership of the movement.
What sort of country will these new leaders be inheriting? I mean, there's no doubt that millions of people love Chávez for his focus on social welfare programs, but what sort of state is the country's finances in?
They're not in very good financial shape at all. You know, inflation is running at more than 20%. Recently, there's a huge devaluation of the bolivar, some 50%. You know, right now the official rate is running at about 6.2 to the dollar, but the black market rate's running at about 25 to the dollar. You know, there's shortages of flour, of meat, other things like that. No, I mean, Venezuela is a very rich country for all the oil it has and the money that generates. But if they hadn't devalued, the government would have found itself in a huge deficit. The devaluation solves that problem, but it just fuels inflation.
Why is that? Is it simply mismanagement? Is the country too dependent on oil? It hasn't diversified enough?
Yes, it's a mix of all that. It's bad management on the part of the government, a tremendous amount of corruption, and they've never been able to get off of oil. And it hasn't helped that there have been all these expropriations of foreign-owned companies and local companies, so that private business doesn't want to invest in Venezuela.
And just lastly, the US is saying that it's looking for a new era in relations with Venezuela. Do you think they're going to be able to get that?
They've wanted it, and they actually began reaching out to Maduro last fall. But Maduro, you know, kicked out two military attaches today, accusing them of meddling. Now, is this just an election ploy so that he can keep up support? Were these guys doing something they shouldn't have been doing? I have no idea. The U.S., I'm sure, will try to reach out to him, but between now and the elections, I don't think they'll be able to do anything.
Okay, Edward Schumacher-Matos, thanks very much for joining us there from New York.
My pleasure. Yeah.
For the Venezuelan police, life on the streets of Caracas is a dangerous business. With guns drawn, they patrol the dark alleyways of the city's rougher neighborhoods, aware that at any time they could be attacked. Officer Ruben Linares says his men are constantly on guard.
Every day we get shot by the gangs here. All the time we constantly seize illegal weapons in this area.
According to the government's own statistics, around 16,000 people were killed in Venezuela last year, but independent groups say that number could easily be double. Amongst the biggest problems are kidnappings, gang-related violence, and a justice system too weak to prosecute the guilty. And those that have lost loved ones live in a permanent state of fear. This woman, who's too afraid to give us her name, lost 2 sons to gang violence and says the authorities have all but ignored her pleas for justice.
Sometimes I would like to take revenge on my son's killers, but I'm not a bad person. You can imagine the pain and frustration I feel. It's like torture for me to see them free, and sometimes they even say hello to me. It's hard for a mother, but I need to look after the one son I have left.
But ignoring crime isn't an option in April's general election. According to a recent poll, almost a third of Venezuelans are deeply concerned about the rising tide of violence.
In this new election, crime could be an issue, and an important issue, and could be a factor that affects the decision of the vote, the result of the election, and the intention of vote.
Whoever wins in April's election will face some serious challenges, but for many, cleaning up the streets and making Venezuela a safer place to live will be a top priority. Andy Gallagher, Al Jazeera, Caracas.
4 years ago, Venezuela's socialist government took over Kai Rosenberg's cocoa farm in the lush coastal forest of Aragua state. Since then, the plantation has declined. So much so that if he got it back today, he says it would take several years to produce high-end beans again.
It's nice.
According to Rosenberg, state workers lack the skills needed to tend to the farm.
People always look down on farmers, but a farmer really needs knowledge. Because take somebody from shanty towns and give him a lot of land. Let's see what he can do with that. Nothing, because he don't have the knowledge.
Cocoa production has dropped across Venezuela. This year, the country will produce around 14,000 tons, the lowest in the modern era. Meanwhile, the world market is booming. In 2011, global sales of chocolate topped $100 billion for the first time.
These people are processing cacao as they have done for generations in Venezuela. The country used to make up about 50% of total global production, but now Venezuela only produces about 1% of all the world's cocoa.
It's not just cocoa either. Agriculture has languished in an economy dominated by oil. The country, which has the world's largest proven oil reserves, imports 70% of its food. Chocolatiers still prize Venezuela's cocoa as some of the finest in the world, especially its famous criollo bean. But some in the business say the policies of longtime President Hugo Chavez, who died earlier this month, kept investors away.
A big challenge for Venezuela is to attract private investment. Now there is a lot of fear for land expropriations from the government, as has been done before. There's a risk involved.
Officials with the state cocoa growers organization refused Al Jazeera's requests for an interview. Regardless of who owns the means of production, Rosenberg says the government is missing a golden opportunity to cash in on the growing appetite for fine chocolate.
Venezuela could be in this world what is Cuba in cigar and tobacco, what is France in champagne, and other countries who are producing something unique.
It's a dream that had little support during Chavez's 14 years in power, but one that some hope will take root in a new era. Adam Rainey, Al Jazeera, in Choroní along Venezuela's northern coast. This is how many people here earn a living. They fill their tank with petrol for less than $1, then sell it on the black market in neighboring Colombia. This smuggler, who asked that we not use his real name, sells about 180 liters every week to middlemen who take it over the border.
I do this out of necessity, to support my children, my family. This is what I live off of. There's no other work here.
Poverty is widespread in this stretch of western Venezuela, and there are few jobs to be had. Service stations are often full of people filling expanded tanks, sometimes 2 to a car, and large capacity barrels. These smugglers may be small scale, but they're part of a massive network feeding fuel into a black market worth billions of dollars a year.
We're here in western Venezuela along the country's Colombian border. Colombia sits just about 50 meters that way, and this area is literally littered with full and empty gasoline tanks. Once it crosses the border, this fuel is 20 times more valuable in Colombia than it is in Venezuela.
We filmed this depot undercover, where cars line up day and night to empty their tanks. The highways are patrolled by soldiers who spend the day confiscating small stashes of gasoline. Venezuela set up a legal cooperative here that sells discounted petrol, up to 1 million liters a month, to Colombia. But it doesn't meet the massive appetite for cheap fuel.
The backroad smuggling is much greater than what crosses legally through the cooperative. No one will be able to get rid of the black market as long as Venezuela doesn't raise its fuel prices.
Although many Venezuelans realize the fuel subsidy is unsustainable, no political leader has dared to cut it, especially as inflation drives up prices on most other goods. The government has installed barcodes on cars meant to track fuel purchases and cut down on smuggling. But the trade continues with the complicity of soldiers and officials.
When you go to the pump, you have to bribe a soldier and a government inspector so they'll let you fill an illegal tank like this. And for bigger trucks, it's more. Each big truck is worth $50,000. 10 to 15 of those cross every day. Imagine how much they pay.
A way of life here on the border unlikely to change anytime soon. Adam Rainey, Paraguachon, on Venezuela's border with Colombia.
A brief and bitter presidential campaign comes to a close. What does the positioning of Enrique Capriles and Nicolas Maduro tell us about the journey ahead for Venezuela? And an insight into the appeal of Chavismo. We take a tour around a poor Caracas neighborhood that's seen many changes. You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Rutansi. A little more than a month after the death of Hugo Chavez, and Venezuela will soon name his successor. The clear favorite is the acting president, Nicolas Maduro, who's promised to continue Chavez's Bolivarian revolution. Frankly, the race hasn't been close, but it has been colorful, with insults flying between both candidates. The opposition leader, Enrique Capriles, has made various attempts to mock his rival, whether over Maduro's former career as a bus driver or for his claim that the spirit of Chavez had approached him in the form of a bird. Maduro, for his part, has hit back, calling Capriles a prince of the bourgeoisie. Coming so soon after the last presidential election and with such a short time frame, it was perhaps too much to expect a truly substantive debate about the many serious issues facing Venezuela. Nonetheless, what can we glean about the future strategies of both government and opposition in the post-Chavez world from their election campaigns? Al Jazeera correspondents attended both candidates' final rallies. First, Gabriel Elizondo with the Maduro camp.
We're here in the middle of well over 1 million people here at the last Nicolas Maduro campaign rally. And Maduro's closing message is very simple. It's that a vote for him is basically an extension of the Chavez legacy here in Venezuela, a legacy that resonates with millions of people in this country. We talked to several of Maduro's supporters. We said, why are you voting for him? They said, because he represents Hugo Chavez. It's a wild and crazy scene here. Now we go over to my colleague, Teresa Bo, who's with the Capriles campaign.
This has been a short, intense and aggressive campaign. Enrique Capriles has traveled all around the country to convince people to vote for him. He has taken this campaign to a personal level, walking to every house and talking to people about their everyday problems like inflation and crime. He has stayed away from criticizing late President Hugo Chavez and from criticizing the revolution, but he has criticized Nicolás Maduro, saying that he's unfit to replace Hugo Chavez. Enrique Capriles has asked people to create what are known as family commands to protect the voting that will take place on Sunday. In spite of the optimism that he has, that he can actually win this election on Sunday, Nicolás Maduro continues to be at least 10 points ahead.
Supporters of Hugo Chavez often point to how much he changed the lives of Venezuela's poor for the better. Someone well placed to witness that change was American Charles Hardy, a Catholic priest sent to live in one of Caracas's slums. He's stayed in the country ever since, and he invited Inside Story America's cameras around his old neighborhood and first described conditions nearly 30 years ago in the days before Chavez.
My name is Charlie Hardy. I was born in Wyoming, lived there most of my life. Back in the 60s, this group of missionaries came to Venezuela, and they decided we will just live in the barrios among the people. And that's how I had the privilege of coming and living in Huehuetacagua. This whole area was built when oil money was pouring into the country. Government housing project, built in the late 70s. This water tank, we never had water, but a contractor got a contract to build a water tank. It never had water in it. So that company or that person made lots of money, but it was of no use whatsoever to the people here. Where I lived was right here. This is a piece of carton, cardboard pressed. What we had was just this thick. And the government just put down a slab of cement and some wood posts and then tacked this on to the walls. I've never met more wonderful people in my life. But it wasn't fair, the conditions they had to live under. We had no water, no sewers. Our electricity we stole. And the thing is, we really felt things would never change. We kept fighting. We fought for housing, but outside of here, we didn't want more houses here. We knew they wouldn't last. And when you look at the history of this place, they didn't last. The buildings crumbled, the mountain, there were landslides. Chavez was elected in 1998. He became president in February of 1999. A few months after that, he came here to Nueva Tacagua, and they dynamited one of the buildings because he did not want this place to go on existing. He wanted people to have dignified houses, okay? But on December 15th of 1999, there were massive landslides in Venezuela. Maybe 50,000 people died one night, okay? Hundreds of thousands of people lost their homes. The idea of the government was when people lost their homes, they should be able to move into a new home. A few years ago, I heard about this Ciudad Caribia, where Chavez had a dream of building a new socialist city. And I didn't know what I was going to see as we went up the mountainside, the road was being built. And then I'd have to say I was really in shock. There's community centers, again, seeing people who lived in Tacagua. I mean, it was neat, you know, come. Oh, can't you stay for supper and look at this? And it was just so beautiful being inside there. Life has changed. And for the people who are still here, they're talking about 3-4 months from now, they're going to have new apartments with 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, and they're looking forward to it, as we were looking forward to it 25 years ago. Life has changed dramatically, and it's basically because of Hugo Chavez. No government had ever done anything like this for the people before. When I left here, after 8 years, you know, I came as a Catholic priest, and when I left here, I was still a Catholic priest functioning. Some people think the work of a missionary is to make conversions. I know of only one conversion, and that was of myself.
Joining me as we look ahead to Sunday's election are from Caracas, Alex Main from the Center for Economic and Policy Research. He's in Venezuela working as an electoral monitor. Also in Caracas, David Smaldi, Senior Fellow at the Washington Office on Latin America. And here in the studio, Carl Meacham, Director of the Americas Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Alex Main, first of all, how would you characterize this very brief election campaign?
Well, far too brief. Obviously, in 2 weeks, it's hard to hold a decent campaign. I think that's been a big frustration of both of the candidates, who are at this point completely exhausted. We haven't heard from them at all today. They finished up the campaign yesterday. But also, I mean, you can really see it as an extension of the campaign that occurred in October, and to a certain extent, the regional elections that occurred after that. Really, the pace of things has sort of stayed the same. A lot of the references, the program is essentially the same. I think that's part of the reason there hasn't been as much sort of debate about some of the big issues, because that was sort of covered back last year. So we're seeing a little bit of a recycling of the agenda of last year and kind of an intensification.
Professor Smaldi, there was quite a serious critique from the left, though, of Nicolás Maduro, suggesting that maybe he should be doing a bit more, even at this stage, to put forward his own vision of how he's going to deepen the Bolivarian revolution and get out of Chavez's shadow. I mean, is that a serious criticism?
I think it's a very true fact about the campaign that it's been largely issue-free. And in fact, there was criticism from within the Chavez camp, from the left, saying that Maduro should come forward and put forward his proposal for the country. I think it's entirely understandable that Maduro has not done that, in the sense that he's the front runner, one, and as Alex just said, this is a very short campaign. So there's not really a lot of time to put forward a message and policy position. So I can certainly understand his position.
And I guess there'll be plenty of time to try and distinguish himself from Chavez in the coming years. But let's look at these platforms then that, as you say, were largely hammered out last year during the election campaign. Enrique Capriles, then, the candidate of the Democratic Unity Roundtable Coalition, known as the MUD, and describes himself as a centrist. His campaign has emphasized the importance of education to bring down crime levels in the country. He's promised not to nationalize any more businesses, but he has promised to continue Hugo Chavez's welfare programs and pledged to raise the minimum wage by 40%. Nicolas Maduro is the candidate of the United Socialist Party of Venezuela, known as the PSUV. He's promising to implement Hugo Chavez's Socialist Plan of the Nation 2013 to 2019, which Chavez ran on last year, which aims to strengthen existing housing and healthcare initiatives, establish more communal councils, and build more state factories. The plan also promises to further erode the influence of large landowners through land redistribution. Maduro also promised to raise the minimum wage by between 38 and 45%. It's fascinating, Carl, how Maduro is once again presenting himself there as this Lula, not Chavez, I suppose, is what he's saying, which is it's a distinction that Lula himself scoffs at, of course, and Lula says, has supported Maduro to the hilt. Are we to really buy this? Capriles has also actually said he's going to increase pensions and food subsidies and medical subsidies. Is he really now a 21st century socialist then?
I think Capriles is in a very difficult situation because he needs to be able to bridge the gap that exists between the hard Chavista supporters and some of the moderates out there. He needs to give them a reason to support him. And a lot of the social programs that President Chavez put forward are very popular with a big group of folks. So this is his way of saying, look, I'm going to change in some areas, but in the areas that you really care about, issues that have to do with social services, the misiones, a lot of the things that President Chavez was popular for.
Like the local groupings that give health care and
right.
so forth.
He chooses to be supportive of them and to say that they would continue under his mandate.
It was notable during the election, Alex, that there was some doubt raised, though, about Capriles's commitment to some of these programs after a document was leaked by the Democratic Unity Coalition in July, and that suggested otherwise. And in fact, it suggested that the policy was going to be very different. It was entitled Economic Actions to be Taken by the Unity Government in 2013. The document said Capriles would deregulate the banking sector, cut back on social spending, including communal councils and housing assistance, remove the, quote, nationalist ideology from the petroleum and mining sector, and cut back on the government marketplaces that sell products to a discount to the poor. Alex, are there still those suspicions that there might be some hidden agenda, or at the very least that there are those in the opposition coalition who have no intention of carrying on the Bolivarian revolution?
Well, absolutely, very much so, because, Capriles hasn't just emerged in the last year. He's been around and been an important political actor in this country for, close to 14, 15 years now. The Primero Justicia, his party, was created in thanks with support from the U.S., from the International Republican Institute, with a very right-wing agenda to start out with. And of course, his party, along with some other of the right-wing opposition groups, supported a coup against President Chavez, which was essentially a coup against some of these very reforms that he is now claiming to support. And so it's very ironic to see today Capriles telling Maduro that he's betraying Chavez's legacy. And we've been seeing, for instance, Capriles going around in a red shirt. Carl's absolutely right. To win this election, he has to win over some of the moderate Chavistas. But I don't think it's coming across as sort of a very honest discourse. And you see, just last year, he was really trashing Chavez. And of course, there was this leak of a document which was essentially a sort of a Reaganomics, a new version of Reaganomics, of bringing back all of these social successes that have been made, where, basically just doing away with a lot of the social programs through a system of privatization. So yes, saying we're going to hold on to the social programs, but we're going to do this by privatizing them. Well, we haven't seen that as being very successful in other states that had welfare systems.
Professor Smaldi, what do you make of it? How is part of it, the unity of the opposition and the pressures on Capriles to, on the one hand, perhaps accept that there's no going back to utter neoliberalism and privatization because of the cohesion of the Bolivarian base, but on the other hand, he has to keep all these rather extremist right-wingers on board as well.
Yeah, I think with Capriles, if you look at it, this isn't just actually an electoral strategy just in the past year. He, as governor in the past couple years, has actually moved towards the left from his originally he sold himself and was very much a center-right politician, one of the founders of Primera Justicia. As he became a governor, and during the Chavez years in which basically Chavez dragged the whole spectrum to the left, he also focused much more on education, much more on health. And so, you know, I think I wouldn't necessarily say it's insincere what he's trying to do. I would say that it's not necessarily all that convincing to average people, because your average person that likes the missions and for whom this real emphasis of the Chavez government on social policy and reaching out to those who have been marginalized during the previous democracy, you know, to say now, okay, well, now I believe Capriles is going to do that better than Maduro, that's kind of a hard sell. Why wouldn't you just stay with the real thing? And I think Capriles is in a tough spot in the sense that he has a coalition that extends to the far right, and also the campaign finances is very vague, so it's very hard to know who's bankrolling his campaign. But you can just assume that there's a lot of people with a lot of money that have a lot of interests that Capriles has to play to, and so I think that's what that document was about in September. So I think he's kind of got it the best or the worst of both worlds, in the sense that he's got the doubts of average people, and he's got the skepticism of the far right as well in his coalition.
And I suppose the key is, though, that under Chavez there was such an increase in democratic participation. Clearly, in the US, certainly, there's this idea that the revolution was very top-down, and Chavez was there and just bribing, you know, the poor. But clearly that there was this huge expansion of community councils and grassroots movements. And in fact, we visited one of those community councils to try and find out what they were expecting from this election. Inside Story America has visited La Vega. It's where people have been organizing from the ground up. They say that that's not going to change no matter who becomes the next president.
The communal councils were the idea of our president, Hugo Rafael Chavez Frias. We as a people have a strong tradition of grassroots organizing, and that led to forming our communal council. The communal councils are part of the revolutionary process because they're a way to address all of the problems in the community. But they also make, discuss, and develop public policies. They develop the consciousness that makes participatory democracy a reality.
My name is Elizabeth Ventura. I am part of the communal council. My role in this community and in this revolution began when Chavez included all of us in his battle for social equality. We all took on the struggle little by little. As a woman, as a mother, as a revolutionary, and then as a community and a people, we began stepping up and assuming these roles with our commander in his struggle.
In the neighborhood of Carretera Negra, the majority of the 35 people in the communal council are women, 10 men, 25 women. And within the communal councils across the country, it's always the women who are out front and center.
The role of women before was a small one, in the sense that women weren't valued for their strength. Keeping up the house, taking care of children, that was the role we thought of for ourselves. Now we are soldiers, reservists, revolutionaries. I think that when our commander came into our lives, we women were still asleep. And it was an awakening, a very strong awakening, like a hurricane, a storm, a wave in our hearts. Because we as women can do more than be in the kitchen taking care of babies. We can be out in the street, we can be involved in politics. Because this revolution, no one can take it away from us. As women, we won't let that happen, ever.
It is we, the people, who are going to continue dictating the revolutionary plan. Our ally, Maduro, is going to win the elections, certainly, but he's going to have to stay close to us, because as communal councils, as grassroots organizations, we're going to keep pushing for change in Venezuela, in Latin America, and the world.
So, Carl Meacham, this is the interesting new variable, then, in the post-Chavez Venezuela, no matter who wins the election, although most will assume it's Maduro who's going to win. This is a pretty sophisticated democratic, these are pretty sophisticated democratic participants in the system now. And if they feel that the promise of Chavez isn't being delivered, then they're going to be pretty vocal. It's going to be a big challenge now. This is this is true democracy, really.
Well, on the one hand, you have the systems or projects like the misiones that the President Chavez put forth that are very popular, as I mentioned before. The issue with some of these approaches to these problems is that you have an economy that's not doing so well anymore. So there's questions there about President Maduro, if he does win, his ability to be able to continue these projects and his ability then to be able to keep his coalition together if he's not able to keep these flagship projects going forward.
But are they just projects, or are they key parts of a Bolivarian philosophy, which they're going to keep going?
I think that's a great question. Alex would probably be able to answer that better. But from my perspective, the question is, are these institutionalized? Are these ways that the government is able to grow institutionally, or are they just initiatives that can go away with the next leader?
We're running out of time already, Alex. Very quickly then, are these, do the economic fundamentals make even these moves forward by Chavez very precarious moving forward, and might that be Maduro's downfall?
Well, actually, the economic fundamentals are quite strong, despite what you're going to read in the media. I mean, the debt level of Venezuela, its debt service is quite low at the moment. Sure, you have fairly high inflation, but you still have a fairly good growth rate, and of course, the economy is very much reliant on oil revenue. But all the experts anticipate, the price of oil staying at a relatively high rate. However, I mean, it's a good point about institutionalization. A lot of these programs really have been created because the institutions of Venezuela weren't working, and that's been a historic problem for decades now. And so they had to sort of be bypassed through these social missions. And now, so these social missions have been to some extent institutionalized, but we have to see how they can be sort of brought into the fold of sort of the normal institutions of Venezuela. So I think that'll be a major challenge going forward.
All right, we've only got 2 minutes left. Professor Smaldi, what about those other issues that we often hear about? The crime, the power grid, I mean, the infrastructure. What specifics are we hearing from both candidates, really, to sort what are, undeniably problems that Venezuela faces?
Well, we've actually heard no specifics regarding infrastructure on either side. Well, Maduro did say he was starting a new mission, electricity mission. It's not clear exactly what that would mean. Maduro has mentioned the issue of citizen security, and I give him a lot of credit for that, because it's a place I don't think he really needed to go in this campaign. Venezuela in the past 4 years has pushed forward with really first-rate citizen security reform. It hasn't really showed results yet, but that's not completely unexpected. These things take a long time. And Maduro has actually has met with some of these people and emphasized the armed control law that's being run through the National Assembly right now. And so I think there's a lot of work to be done there. I think the infrastructure is going to be a huge issue over the next couple of years. And citizen security, I'm hoping that Maduro is going to give continuity to some of the processes that are already in place.
We're going to pick up on some of those themes on our show on Monday, when we'll look at the results of the election, and we will have more time to look at what is next for Venezuela. But very quickly, Professor Smaldi, as far as this election is concerned, we have these reports about the opposition potentially not accepting the victory, lots of rumors as usual. I mean, are any of these plausible? Wouldn't that be political suicide for the opposition?
Yeah, I think it would. I think the rumors that I've heard, I think this could be, if Maduro's margin is less than people think, if it's less than 10 points, if it's 5 points or so, that Capriles might delay acknowledging the victory and just to kind of put pressure on the government, because I think if that happens, the opposition is going to sense weakness in Maduro, and they're very much going to be organizing for a recall referendum in 2 or 3 years. And so something like that could happen, but Capriles has recognized immediately last time, and I think the opposition has really learned from its mistakes in the past, and I doubt that there's going to be any real rejection of the electoral result.
Professor David Smaldi, thank you very much. Alex Main, thank you. Carl Meacham, thank you as well. And that's all from the team in Washington, D.C. for now.
Caracas resident Dolmar Sarabia is stocking up on supplies, and one in particular, toilet paper. It's one of many basic items she sometimes can't find at local supermarkets. Oil, sugar, and meat, a whole freezer of it. She stocks up on everything.
When there are shortages, I'm always prepared because I'm always shopping. I have to go to many supermarkets all over the place, even in other parts of Venezuela, and so I always have things at home.
But it's the shortage of toilet paper that has caused the most anger. The government had to import 50 million rolls to deal with the problem. At government-run markets like this one, shoppers find most basics that are sometimes lacking at smaller private shops. Even here, though, they snap up staples as if they might not see them for a while.
And where there aren't shortages, there are long lines like this one, full of dozens of people lining up just to buy basic goods. That's things like oil, sugar, flour, beans, and of course, toilet paper.
Deputy Minister Rafael Coronado oversees distribution for thousands of government-run markets. He says there aren't shortages.
We have a big problem, and that's price speculation. And that's not a government policy, this is coming from the private sector.
But according to Venezuela's central bank, the country is suffering its worst bout of shortages since the bank started releasing figures on them in 2009. According to the bank, on any given day, shoppers can't find more than 20% of common items on market shelves. Venezuela's largest state will start rationing some basic items next week, tracking purchase with an electronic chip assigned to shoppers. Many economists say shortages will continue as long as the government keeps trying to control prices and prop up the local currency, seen by nearly all as artificially high.
The only way to stop or reduce the shortages is to either adjust the exchange rate of our currency to the dollar or adjust the price controls on certain products.
And that's the challenge for Venezuela. Its socialist government has made cheap food a cornerstone of its policy to help the poor. But it's price controls that could be making it tougher for Venezuelans, rich and poor alike, to get the groceries they rely on every day. Adam Rainey, Al Jazeera, Caracas. For more than a decade, Globovision has been the go-to channel for people looking for news critical of Venezuela's government. But those days could be coming to an end. In May, the channel was sold to a group of investors who say they want it to move to the center. Kiko Bautista hosted a nightly commentary show for Globovision that was critical of the government. Under the new bosses, Bautista carried on as usual for the first 3 weeks. That is, he says, until President Nicolás Maduro told the new directors they had to change their tune.
Nosotros llegamos al programa, transmitimos un video de Enrique Capriles Radonqui, que es el candidato.
I came into work and we broadcast a tape of an event with opposition leader Enrique Capriles. And they fired me immediately. They said it wasn't our editorial line to broadcast that. I said I hadn't known that, but I would have broadcast it anyway because it's news.
Globovision denied our request for an interview. It's not the only media outlet to be sold recently.
Just weeks after Globovision has been sold off, now a chain of 3 newspapers has been sold as well. One of the publications of that chain is Últimas Noticias. It's one of the leading newspapers here in Venezuela. And the concern for critics is, with all these deals taking place, Venezuelans might find less news critical of the government.
Journalism loses, truth loses, objectivity loses, the opposition loses. But Globovision isn't the only option. There are alternatives.
The government already controls 6 TV stations, and the main one, VTV, runs blatant pro-government propaganda. Most Venezuelans tune into private media or cable outlets for their news. Opposition leader and 2-time presidential candidate Enrique Capriles says his speeches won't be carried anymore on Globovision. Fearing a media blackout, he's launched a website to carry his speeches online in case they don't get on air. President Maduro beat Capriles in an election in April, just weeks after his predecessor and mentor Hugo Chavez died. Maduro now faces several challenges: one of the world's highest murder rates, spiraling inflation, and widespread grocery shortages. The challenge, though, of getting the government's message across in a changing media landscape could be less of a concern. Adam Rainey, Al Jazeera, Caracas.
Nearly 2 months after winning Venezuela's presidential election, Nicolás Maduro grapples with food shortages and inflation. You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. I'm Shihab Ritansi. On Tuesday, Venezuela's Election Council announced that an audit of the results of the country's presidential election confirmed Maduro won by 1.5 percentage points over Enrique Capriles. Maduro's supporters will hope that puts any doubts about the legitimacy of his win to rest, as the country suffers from a shortage of foods and some basic goods. Data from Venezuela's central bank suggests that out of 100 key items, 21 are not available. On Sunday, Maduro halted a plan to restrict the sale of 20 basic food items in the state of Zulia, calling it insane. Instead, he said the best way to counter the shortage is to, quote, produce, produce, produce. Inflation is high, and critics suggest the country's economy is overly centralized and too dependent on oil. But Maduro's supporters point out that since Hugo Chavez began his Bolivarian revolution, inflation has in fact been considerably less than under his neoliberal predecessors, Rafael Caldera and Carlos Perez. The government's also trying to negate the impact of inflation with price controls on some basic items and the provision of subsidized groceries and welfare services. The irony is that the shortage comes at a time when Venezuela is receiving international plaudits for reaching its UN targets on eradicating hunger earlier than most other countries in the world. I spoke to Marcela Resende, the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization representative in Venezuela. He explained the country's achievement.
Venezuela is one of 35 countries in the world that has achieved the Millennium Development Goal of halving the number of people who suffer from hunger. There are two important factors that have allowed Venezuela to do this. One is access to food. Venezuela has one of the best public networks of food distribution. Across the country, there are 23,000 food distribution centers, supermarkets, little stores, open-air markets. All of these places make food available to the people who need it the most. And the second factor, from the perspective of access to food, are the government subsidies available to the majority of people in the country. Food products are subsidized by the government and kept at prices that make them both accessible and affordable for the majority of the population.
So do you think there are lessons for other countries, both in the region and in the world, as they try and achieve their Millennium Goals?
I think Brazil has had a similar experience. In question of which countries have been most successful in eradicating hunger, they are the countries that are implementing structural public policies, policies that redistribute wealth and promote the reduction of social inequality. Those are the basic economic factors that are necessary to eradicate hunger. The Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations has a very clear position, and that is that the problem of hunger in the world doesn't have to do with the availability of food. There is enough food in the world to feed everyone. The problem is access and the ability of the people to buy food. The countries that have adopted public policies that reduce social inequality and promote the redistribution of wealth effectively are the countries who are eradicating hunger around the world.
But we have this irony, though, that you're congratulating Venezuela at a time when there are shortages of some basic foodstuffs in the supermarket shelves. How should we interpret that? How do we interpret both these ideas at the same time, that they're eradicating hunger, and yet there are food shortages of basic items?
It's true. There are two factors. Venezuela at the beginning of the 1990s had 4 million people suffering from hunger in the country. Today, the percentage of people, according to our data, is less than 2.5% of the population. And that's because there is an ample network of stores and food banks. But without a doubt, there is a problem with management. The crisis of food shortages right now is partly caused by the management of the networks of government stores. But it's a crisis in which certain products are scarce for a set period of time. In my opinion, that's due to poor administration. I think the scarcity of some products in some stores is also related to the guidelines that have been set for importing food.
Marcela Resende, thank you very much for joining us. I'm joined from Caracas by David Smaldy. He's a senior fellow at the Washington Office on Latin America. In New York, Gregory Wilpert is editor of VenezuelaAnalysis.com. And Miguel Ticosalas joins us from Claremont, California. He's professor of Latin American history at Pomona College. David Smaldy, first of all, then, it's probably not a bad idea just to explain exactly what we mean as we talk about shortages. We're not talking then about malnutrition and starvation. You're in Caracas. Help us understand what these shortages actually mean on a daily basis.
Well, what it actually means is that you can't get what you want when you want all the time. No, it doesn't mean that there's mass hunger, it doesn't mean that there's famine. What it means is that, for example, to say that there's a 20% general scarcity index, that means if you're looking for 10 products in one store, it's likely that they're not going to have 2 of them. No? If basically this 20% scarcity index, that does not mean, as I just saw on the BBC, that does not mean that out of 100 products you can't get 21. What that actually means is that, for any given product, what they do is they have investigators go to stores and see how many stores have that product. So a 41%, for example, a scarcity of milk means that of 100 stores, 41 don't have it. So it's a nuisance, it's a problem, but it doesn't mean that you can't get these products. It just means that it can be more difficult, means that you have to be in lines, means that during a week you have to go to 10, 15 stores to get what you want. It also can mean that at certain times you can't get for a week or so something that you need because the 5 or 6 stores that you go to don't have it. So if you go a week without cooking oil, that can be very alarming. If you go a week without toilet paper, that can be downright uncomfortable.
Right, and of course we're always very happy to correct the faulty analysis of the BBC when it comes to Latin America here. Professor Tinker-Salas there, I mean, we do have the UN meanwhile celebrating Venezuela's achievements in eradicating malnutrition and hunger. So it's not a bad idea just to have some historical context. A few decades ago we were talking about malnutrition and hunger when we talked about food shortages.
Right, and in the context of Venezuela, we've seen a dramatic increase in the caloric intake. We've seen a dramatic increase in consumption from 13 million tons of food when Chavez was first elected to over 26 million tons of food now. So it's really not a question of faulty goods not being available in all places. There's a problem in distribution, there's a problem in certain given shortages, but overall consumption has increased at a time that the population has also dramatically increased. And that's something we tend to forget to include in our conversations. Venezuela is now reaching about 30 million people. And this is not simply a contemporary issue. There's a historic issue here because since 1930s, Venezuela has been a net importer of food. And again, it's not an issue or a problem only over the last 14 years. It's been aggravated over the last 14 years, but it's a historic problem in the context of Venezuela and its inability to produce most of what it consumes.
All right, and as the government likes to point out, in 1999, Venezuelans consumed 13.8 million tons of food. By 2012, that number was up to 26.8 million tons of food. Meanwhile, food production has increased by 71%, they say, since 99, but consumption has increased by 94% in that same period. But Greg Wilpert, is that enough to explain food shortages at the moment? Are there any specific reasons for there being food shortages now in 2013?
Yes, I think there are really 2 reasons. One is economic and the other is more political. That is, on the economic side, it is well known that in Venezuela there was a devaluation, and just before the election, and at the same time there was also a process of getting rid of one of the exchange mechanisms. Venezuela up until that point had 2 ways of exchanging bolivares into dollars in order to import products, and they got rid of one of them because it wasn't working too well. And so that slowed down the process of exchanging the money and therefore slowed down the process of importing food items. I think that was probably a strategic mistake, which has been realized in the meantime, but it was, and it even probably contributed to the narrow election margin of President Maduro when he got elected. So that's one factor. And the other factor is more political. There's been a tradition or history of shortages, usually shortly around election time. And so I think there are politically motivated importers who intentionally want to make the government look bad and therefore slow down the process of imports and therefore produce shortages. So those are really 2 of the main causes, I think. And then, of course, what you had mentioned earlier is, of course, the whole process of domestic production, which hasn't been able to keep up with the increase in consumption. And that's certainly also an important factor, which is, of course, of a more long-range issue, right, which hasn't been able to, the government hasn't been able to solve yet.
And that is a question, Professor Smiley. Why haven't they been able to solve that? Clearly there have been increases in food production. But clearly then you wouldn't have to rely on opposition importers of food then and to make political capital out of food shortages if you were producing enough food, if you had proper food security. What hasn't happened that needed to happen, and why hasn't it happened yet?
Well, those are complex economic issues. I mean, if you look at the numbers, I think Miguel mentioned this. Production is actually up. The last numbers I saw, that actual vegetable production per person was up by 50% during the Chavez years. I mean, that sounds pretty good, but it's not really enough. As Miguel mentioned, this is a historic problem. Venezuela has never been self-sufficient in terms of food. And when you go into this period you have a very high economic growth, a lot of oil money coming in, it's very difficult. The actual percentage of the gross domestic product made up by agriculture production has actually doubled, but that's just been from 5 to 10%. It's still a very small part of the economy. It's very hard to boost that kind of production to keep up with a growth in consumption that's been caloric intake has grown by 50% during the Chavez years, and so it's been difficult. They've actually made some progress, and interestingly, beyond stereotypes, the progress that's been made has actually been in terms of efficiency. No, there's actually fewer people working in agriculture, but more production because of mechanization. But it's been really hard to keep up with economic growth and with increasing consumption. So it's just been very difficult.
And of course, there's always that problem, Professor Tinker Sallerson, of land distribution as well. I mean, this isn't just a problem in Venezuela, but in Colombia and elsewhere. I mean, does that mean? I mean, certainly the figures we always see is that large landowners often leave 30 to 40% of the land in Venezuela uncultivated. I mean, so does that suggest that despite the uproar of Chavez's land reform programs that there was, he perhaps wasn't bold enough then in trying to redistribute this land to make it more productive?
Well, I think that one of the ironies of this entire revolution in Venezuela is that we actually are dealing with a capitalist society in which a tremendous amount of the land is in private hands. And those individuals, as an old saying in Venezuela, hay que engordar la vaca, in other words, fatten up the land as a tool of investment. So yes, you have a large amount of land that's lying fallow because it's being used for speculation. Another large amount of land that's being used for cattle production and for grazing, and only a very small amount of land that's actually under production for food distribution. And that's one of the main challenges, so that although you've had a discourse about food sovereignty and food production and food protection, although you've had a discourse about communal properties and new forms of distribution and production, the reality is that it has not kept up with the consumption, with the demand, or with the population. And this is the ultimate irony. Venezuela, as an oil-rich country, has created the expectation that people can continue to expect to consume at a much higher level than other countries in Latin America. So that's one of the main contradictions that they have not been able to break out of, and that has been there throughout the 20th century. Venezuela began the 20th century with about 12 to 15 large productive estates, and it has not been able in many ways to redistribute that land in an efficient way to ensure consumption and production.
But I'm sure the members of the opposition will say, Greg, this is all very well, but in the end, the underlying problem with all of this is the general mismanagement of the economy in the Chavez years, specifically the money from the petroleum sector, I guess, which has led to all these problems. We know about some of these structural problems in Venezuela that may be historical, but in the end, if the whole economy is, that seems to be the summary of Venezuela's economy in the Western media, certainly, is it's a bit of a mess, and so obviously you're going to get shortages.
Well, the opposition has been predicting the demise of the Venezuelan economy over the past 14 years, and it hasn't happened yet. They've been predicting it every year. Next year will be when it crashes, and it still doesn't happen. There's one issue, though, an economic problem that Venezuela indeed faces, which is precisely its oil revenues. That is, the oil revenues come into the country and produce something that economists call the Dutch disease, which basically raises prices in general and makes it too expensive, really, to export anything else, or to produce anything else, really, at a profit. And so they resort to importing. And so the oil sector, in effect, always ends up dominating unless you keep the oil dollar outside of the country. But that's, of course, something that you don't want to do in a third world country. If you have the oil resources, you want to use them. So that's a real big dilemma, whether or not to use the oil resources and drown out the rest of the economy, but at least give up, increase the level of equality and decrease the inequality or the poverty level, or you keep it out and try to lift yourself up by your bootstraps without the oil revenues.
But just, I mean, Professor Smaldi, is there any sense that Nicolas Maduro is spelling out some sort of coherent policy in the agricultural sector then perhaps, or in other sectors then to address these shortages at the moment? I mean, clearly, one would imagine that land reform isn't on the agenda given the margin of his victory and how much uproar there was even when Chavez was trying to do a bit of it. So, I mean, is he spelling out any sort of coherent policy to address these shortages right now?
Well, there's some signs. I mean, I think Maduro has done something that Chavez didn't do for a long time, and that is sit down and dialogue with the private sector, including agricultural producers. So I think that's a good sign. And, you know, there's been some talk about changing the foreign exchange regime. I think they have some internal battles going on about exactly what to do, because I think that's really the problem that's behind this, and I think there is some serious mismanagement there. The currency is way overvalued, and that's what really increases this this reliance on imports, and I think it sort of complicates domestic production. And so, you know, they're getting to the point where there's a real scarcity of dollars, and I think that's what's behind a lot of these scarcities. Now, the Maduro government, there's talk about they're going to try to open up the exchange regime for non-essential products, but it's not clear exactly where they're going to go, whether there's going to be a new bond issue or exactly what they're going to do with that. But I think Maduro is a little bit more pragmatic than Chavez is economically. I think for the past 2 months, he's had a rough 2 months, and I don't think there's been a whole lot of coherent strategies because it's basically been day-to-day putting out fires as they appear.
Right, and we'll perhaps look at that pragmatism in a moment, because I think there's some unease amongst the Bolivarian base about what we call pragmatism there, but we'll get into that a bit later. But let's look at some of the other economic indicators. I mean, all of this is kind of adding to that sense of unease post-Chavez that Maduro may not be up to the job, let's face it. And you know, whether, you know, there's that question as to whether he could really fill these shoes. These are the other economic challenges then. For the month of May, the inflation rate is 6.1%, or was 6.1%. The accumulated inflation rate for 2013 up to May is close to 20%. That's the same as it was for all of 2012. Food prices were up 10% in May, adding to the problems already created by the shortages we've just been discussing. Economic growth in the country slowed to less than 1% in the first quarter of this year. That's compared to almost 6% during the same period last year. Professor Tinker-Salas, meanwhile, actually, first of all, has Maduro spelled out a coherent economic plan to address all of these problems, then, not just then production problems and so forth?
I would agree with David that he has not been able to spell out a coherent economic plan, and that in many ways this is a presidency that starts with no honeymoon period, with zero margin for error, a president that has been attacked relentlessly in national media, the international media. His very legitimacy has been questioned. Relations with the U.S. have been difficult, although they seem to be improving somewhat. So although he had the support of all the Latin American governments and most of the international community, it's been a president who's been besieged. So in many ways, he has been attempting to deal with crisis after crisis, and there hasn't been a coherent strategy and a coherent process. And I think that they actually fell asleep at the wheel in some cases. I mean, this is a question of economic issues and of the scarcity that was evident in January. It was evident again in February, coming off of the Christmas holiday season, which usually was a period in which there was scarcity. And they didn't seem to be prepared to deal with it. They were dealing with the Chavez's illness, then eventually Chavez's death, and then the election. And in many ways, they didn't attend to the major issue of the economy, and I think that's fundamentally, as Greg said, hurt them in the election bid. So I think that there's also other factors that they are relentlessly being attacked on a constant basis, and there's also speculation in the economy. Let's suggest that when I was in Caracas less than 3 weeks ago, I could walk into an affluent neighborhood in Altamira or in other areas of Caracas and find most of the products, but when I traveled to Mérida, they weren't there. But they were there in the street being sold by in the informal sector. So there's a lot of speculation going on, which the government also hasn't been able to control. And a lot of the products in western Venezuela are finding their way to Colombia as well. But ration cards will not work in Venezuela, not with the expectations people have in terms of an oil-producing country.
But it's interesting, when you look at those economic indicators, there's another reminder, Professor Tinker Salas, that again, despite all the headlines we've had for years under Chavez, this is a fundamentally capitalist. In some ways, I mean, the neoliberal structures are still in place because the financial sector is booming. A lot of people are making a lot of money. The growth in the financial sector was 31% in the first quarter of this year. Meanwhile, manufacturing was down 3.6%. I mean, that doesn't look like a socialist economy to me on the face of it then.
It is a very eclectic economy. So you have the discourse of socialism for the 21st century. You have the financial sector making booming amount of profits. You have the malls filled to the rim during the holidays. And you have consumption increasing dramatically. And Venezuelans want to have all the consumer products that all the neighbors have. The highest rates of BlackBerry consumption in Latin America. The highest rates of Scotch production in Scotch consumption in Latin America. So they want to have all those elements. Now, obviously, greater numbers of Venezuelans now have access to them. And that's in part causing part of the problems in the actual consumption.
Greg Wilpert, then, we were talking about Maduro's pragmatism, and there has been this cozying up to big business that we've seen. I mean, Lorenzo Mendoza, the owner of Polar, the largest private company in Venezuela, no friend of the Bolivarian revolution, it has to be said. I mean, that had some of, in the base perhaps a little concerned. Lots of cozying up to the Americans as well, for that matter. New deals with Chevron, which again has some, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but still, I mean, there's this kind of fundamental disconnect sometimes between the rhetoric of the Bolivarian revolution and actually what's going on the business side of things. What are we to make of all that? I mean, there are some who are concerned about Maduro's radical credentials at the very least.
Well, I mean, I think it's rather mixed, actually. If you look at, for example, he just appointed a new head of the Consumer Protection Agency who's considered to be a radical, which is precisely the agency that is supposed to enforce price controls and make sure that there's no hoarding. And so I mean, he's and various other places he's done some interesting things. For example, also pushing forward the communal councils with a new minister there. But on the other hand, like you said, these negotiations with the private sector. Another way to interpret that perhaps is also that it's an effort to divide the opposition, because the opposition right now has been constantly at the heels of the government and focusing on an international campaign to discredit the government. But at the same time, Maduro, I think, is a smart move actually. If he can win over the private sector and kind of get them to be on his side, or at least not against him, that would significantly weaken the opposition. Same thing with the United States. If the United States finally recognizes the Maduro government by sending an ambassador, that would be a significant blow to the opposition.
And there does seem, Professor Smiley, to be some sort of de facto recognition. We had the meeting between the Venezuelan foreign minister and John Kerry in Guatemala. We had that deal signed with Chevron. I mean, clearly the U.S. wouldn't be doing this if they hadn't basically accepted Maduro's presidency, despite any rhetoric that we might get from the State Department.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what happened last week was very significant. I think it was a really interesting move on the part of the Venezuelan government. I think it was pretty astute in the sense that it came on the heels of Santos receiving Capriles in Bogota and announcing that he had intentions of strengthening ties to NATO. But the Maduro government turned around and sought out the United States and reached out, and the United States accepted, and I think that there's a real breakthrough there. And I think that complicates things for Capriles, complicates things for the opposition, because basically, they've announced for weeks now that once they exhaust the internal courts and instances in contesting the election, they're going to go to international courts. And basically, the people whose ears they had was the United States and Colombia, and now they're reconciling with the United States. And so I think that it sort of puts an end to that strategy for Capriles. I think it's significant. I think it does tacitly show that the U.S. government recognizes that Maduro won the election. And hopefully it will lead to the exchange of ambassadors.
Greg Wilpert, what about Maduro's popularity in general, then other political ramifications of the shortages? You mentioned the grassroots council, this very healthy, vibrant grassroots democracy that was built up over the last 13 years or so. I mean, how are they reacting to the uncertainty, or at least some of the economic uncertainty that seems to be underway in Venezuela right now?
Well, certainly the economic issues are undermining the Maduro government. I think he's certainly chipping away at his popularity. On the other hand, there are other issues that are maintaining it, one of them being the fight against crime. They've sent the military out into the barrios, and it seems to be bearing first fruits. I mean, according to official government statistics, they've brought crime down by almost 50% in the past month. So that would, if that's true, which I think it might be a slightly high figure, but even a slight reduction would be a significant improvement, considering that crime had been rising up until now. And then Maduro is also constantly in contact and in touch with people in the different communities, traveling throughout the country and talking about their problems and issues through this, what they call government of the street, which they're having constantly. And so those are all factors that I think are contributing to his popularity. So it's a mixed bag so far, and I haven't seen recent poll results, but I assume it's probably still around 50%.
And Professor Tinker-Sellas, what about the different factions that make up the Bolivarian Revolution leadership? I mean, there's always a rumor every week about the president or the speaker rather of the National Assembly, Diosdado Cabello, perhaps having some coup in the works with members of the Officer Corps. I mean, this is just what we hear every week. But I mean, are they all sticking together, or is there scope for Maduro's downfall in the factionalism that's been left behind after Chavez died?
I think the PSUV and its leadership recognize very much that any divisions within them right now would play into the hands of the opposition. I think it would be ludicrous for them at any level to think that this is a time to actually break ranks. In fact, it's problematic from many levels, because this is a time when the PSUV should also engage in self-criticism. This is a time when the leadership of the organization should actually do what Chavez talked about previously, about the 3 R's, the 3 rectifications, to revise the past, to recognize the mistakes, and to go forward. But this is a time we were not seeing it, precisely because they're closing ranks, precisely because they in fact are afraid that any divisions within their ranks might lead or might benefit the opposition. But in either case, they are being criticized. If one looks at any one of the PSUV or the left websites in Venezuela, there's ample criticisms in terms of some of the very same issues we've been addressing here, in terms of food distribution, in terms of efficiency, in terms of corruption. So I think we're seeing a lively debate within Venezuela from within the left and from within sectors that support the government, but I don't think we're seeing any major divisions within the PSUV that would lead or benefit the opposition. And in fact, Mr. Cabello right now had been in Cuba for a few days before he traveled abroad to other countries in the world. So I don't see at this point any divisions. I think the example of what happened in Grenada in the 1980s and a division in the New Jewel movement is a clear example for Venezuela's leadership to understand that divisions invariably will lead to their collapse and their demise.
Professor Miguel Tinker-Sellas, thank you very much. Greg Wilpert, thank you. Professor David Swaldi, thank you as well. And that's all from the team in Washington, D.C. for now. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook, where you can find more information about the program. And we want to hear from you. Share ideas with us on Twitter. Our handle is AJInsightStoryAM.
Their tactic to protest, even if they're small in numbers. They're loud and efficient. These university students blocked a main road in central Caracas on Tuesday. Student leader Hilda Rubí says there's a lack of consistency in the financial incentives handed out by the government.
The government talks so much about socialism. What we're demanding is that they make scholarships equal.
They also want the government to increase university budgets. Teachers are asking for higher salaries.
In the end, it's a fight for our universities, the teacher salaries. The global budget is not enough. The dining area, the labs are all in terrible condition.
For over a month, students and university teachers have been protesting around the country. They say they want the government to listen to their demands, but they want to do it in a peaceful way because they don't want to clash with the government.
For some students, resolving these issues has become an urgent matter. Verónica Achón sewed her lips in protest at what she calls the government's indifference. Oscar Salazar has been on hunger strike for 35 days.
My life is in the government's hands, and that of 15 other students like me. The government's lack of interest to resolve our issues has made our health critical.
Public universities in Venezuela have been on strike for weeks. They say nearly 30 universities around the country are in crisis. They say the government has not revised its budgets in 3 years despite rising inflation rates. Still, President Maduro and his ministers enjoy widespread support. There was a promise of improved salaries and budgets following a meeting with pro-government student groups last month. In this politicized and polarized country, issues are divided between those who support the government's policies and those who don't. However, these students say their demands have not been met yet, and they are still waiting for answers. Mariana Sanchez, Al Jazeera, Caracas, Venezuela.
In Venezuela, baseball fields are sacred grounds. One of the few places where people in this deeply divided country can escape politics, news of rising inflation, and worsening crime. Like Antonio Rosic, who brought his twin boys to see their home team play for the first time.
When we are in the stadium, it's all about baseball. So the political difference just keep aside, and we all, enjoy the game. We support our teams.
But when these fans go home, the political and economic crisis that's gripping Venezuela is hard to ignore. Just 6 months in office, President Nicolas Maduro faces inflation running at nearly 50%. Hard currency shortages, power cuts, and growing protests. To deal with these crises, he's now asking lawmakers to grant him special powers to pass laws unilaterally. But many here, even some of his own supporters, are uncomfortable with the move. Like Celia Segovia, who now spends 3 days a week going from market to market trying to buy hard-to-find basics like sugar, rice, and cooking oil.
If he hasn't done anything yet, why is he asking for more power?
Analysts believe many so-called Chavista supporters like Celia are disenchanted with Maduro.
People had an almost irrational love for Chavez, and so they forgave him almost anything. But Maduro doesn't have his charisma, so many Chavez militants are now asking themselves, where is this movement going?
Back at the game, Antonio admits that he's unsure what lies ahead for his country.
We are worried about the future because, this crisis is going deep and deep every day. Venezuela is a great country, so we trust that we will go, we will move forward and we'll pass this very bad situation.
A sentiment he hopes he and the rest of the country can hold on to. Rachel Levin, Al Jazeera, Caracas, Venezuela.
With his country facing mounting shortages and sky-high inflation, Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro has announced a series of measures to fight what he calls economic sabotage.
Our enemies have planned this aggression against our homeland, and they are the same people who have been behind every plan in the last 14 years to end the Bolivarian Revolution.
Maduro is creating a centralized agency to control its foreign exchange system. US dollars are sold on the black market at a price 8 times higher than the official rate. And he's sending civilian and military inspectors into every supermarket and store to control prices, looking for merchants accused of hiking prices and hoarding goods like toilet paper. Some analysts think these measures are just more of the same.
These people have convinced themselves that any problem they encounter is the product of forces conspiring against them. And their answer is more policing, more repression. But none of this will address the underlying issues affecting our economy.
To implement this plan, Maduro is asking the National Assembly to give him special decree powers for a year. The measure is expected to pass easily, but on the street of Caracas, people think it's time for the government to recognize its responsibilities.
These are the same economic measures they've been implementing for a long time, but the Venezuelan people don't see any improvement. At my age, I often have to stay in line from 3 in the morning until 1 p.m. to buy 2 chickens.
But government supporters say Maduro should get another chance.
As long as these measures can benefit the people, whatever they are, we should welcome them. But we need to do something to help the people now.
Maduro knows he needs to show results, and fast. Next month, Venezuelans will vote for mayors in more than 300 cities across the country. The opposition want that to be a referendum on the president's rule. Alessandro Ampietti, Al Jazeera, Caracas. Hundreds of bargain hunters crowded this electronics store in Caracas. But it wasn't a regular sales day. It was one promoted by the government.
I've ordered the immediate occupation of that chain and to put all the items for sale for the people at a fair price. All products, all of them, that nothing is left in the stores. Enough. Enough.
With his country facing mounting shortages and sky-high inflation, President Maduro sent the military into stores accused of hiking prices. The managers of this chain were arrested, and the stores were forced to reopen with goods priced at levels set by the state. Maria Emilia Sanchez said she welcomed the government's intervention.
I have been trying to buy a refrigerator for 1 month now, and I haven't been able to do so because the goods are too expensive. What's happening seems like an exaggeration.
In the city of Valencia, shoppers took the sale a step forward, looting a store that was closed by the military. While hundreds of people gathered for a protest against the government plan in Caracas.
It's a spontaneous civil society gathering to try and offer some hope to the people and demand change. Crime and inflation are killing us.
Maduro accuses alleged speculators of trying to sabotage the economy, but many feel excessive government controls are to blame. With local elections looming in December, the government knows it needs to show it can fix this economy, and fast. Alessandro Ampietti, Al Jazeera, Caracas.
William Barriento.
Following in the footsteps of Hugo Chavez. 6 months in the job, Venezuela's president Nicolás Maduro asked the National Assembly for exceptional powers to rule by decree for a year. On Thursday, he got the first of the 2 votes he needs.
We have approved the first discussion of the habilitating law that gives Nicolás Maduro special powers to keep fighting against corruption and speculators.
Maduro says he needs the powers to deal with inflation running at over 50% and serious shortage of basic goods such as milk and toilet paper, and fight what he calls economic warfare. Over the weekend, Maduro sent soldiers into electronic stores to cut prices, sending people into a frenzy of bargain hunting. With his new powers, he promised to slash prices of most products, impose limits on private sector profits, and crack down on black market currency speculators. But some fear he'll use them against political rivals.
El presidente de la República puede hacer cualquier cosa.
The president will be able to do anything he wants with the law. I have the impression that he will use this instrument to legally harass, intimidate, and suppress even more any opposition.
Maduro's Socialist Party gained the majority it needs to give him special powers after the assembly removed an opposition politician for fraud. Representative Maria Aranguren, a former Chavista, said the charges were trumped up.
I call on the government and the other powers to at least pretend. Don't be so obvious and evident in what you are trying to do to the Venezuelan people.
The vote comes less than 1 month before local elections, seen as a referendum on the president's rule. Maduro hopes these special powers will convince people he can fix the country's growing economic issues. Alessandro Ampietti, Al Jazeera, Caracas.
President Nicolás Maduro is now one of the most powerful leaders in Latin America. The Enabling Act was passed by Parliament, allowing Hugo Chávez's successor to pass stringent new laws without consulting Congress. He's promised to wage a war on corruption, and private business owners he believes are bent on destroying Venezuela's ailing economy. And in Bolivar Square, his supporters were jubilant.
It's a war between the elites and the poor. They have forced us to kneel down. They did whatever they wanted until President Chavez came. And now President Maduro continues to liberate us.
We are very proud of Maduro. He's the man, and he was the best gift that Chavez left us, because Maduro is his son, and he's doing everything that we have been expecting.
President Maduro has already jailed 100 shopkeepers for charging too much. Now he can force them to reduce their prices and take control of businesses viewed as corrupt. But opposition leaders say this latest move is a blatant power grab, and they now fear he'll use the act to silence critics.
So at the end, democracy loses
because democracy loses spaces for open discussion, democracy loses spaces for citizen participation.
This is President Maduro's boldest move since he came to power in April, and it's proving popular amongst Venezuela's poor. But the 50-year-old former bus driver still faces challenging times ahead.
Even with his sweeping new powers, Nicolas Maduro will have to deal with an economy in freefall. Inflation is soaring, there's still a chronic shortage of basic goods on the shelves here, and a seemingly unstoppable black market in US dollars. But ultimately, Venezuelans will get to decide whether this latest bold move is right for their country or not when they vote in municipal elections in 3 weeks' time. Andy Gallagher, Al Jazeera, Caracas, Venezuela.
For endless hours every day on television, President Nicolás Maduro is following the steps of the late President Hugo Chavez, announcing government plans, passing laws. He's even given out his phone number to connect with the people live on TV. President Nicolás Maduro claims to be a son of Chavez.
I was able to interpret profoundly the soul and the thinking of Commander Chavez, and I think that marked the profile of my personality. He left his imprint on what I do and what is left to do in the years to come in a decisive way.
Trying to be Chavez is hard. He was a media master. Chavez led his so-called socialist revolution over the airwaves with unparalleled charm.
Chavez was a very funny guy with a great sense of humor. You could be against him, but recognize that he was witty. Maduro doesn't have that, and he's put in a lot of time practicing his media routine. He's very visible in the media, portraying himself strong, belligerent, aggressive. Charisma can't be inherited.
Anyone in Venezuela would say that Chavez is irreplaceable. So the strategy is to present Maduro like Chavez to ensure continuity in the government.
Deyanira Rivera is working for Chavez's so-called socialist revolution to continue. She supports Maduro because Chavez said so.
The president was very intelligent and intuitive, and he said Nicolás Maduro was to be his successor. The people digested the idea and accepted it.
Analysts say Maduro is slowly becoming his own man.
As time goes by, Maduro is turning more into himself, building his own identity. He is now more serene, with a strong authority.
As Maduro takes on the role Chavez gave him a year ago, he's always reminding Venezuelans that for him and millions of others, Chavez is, and even now remains, Commander-in-Chief. Mariana Sanchez, Al Jazeera, Caracas, Venezuela.
Riding between traffic lanes, blowing red lights, even ambushing drivers. Motorcycles have invaded Caracas, becoming a major safety concern. Atsieli Perez was assaulted while stuck in the bumper-to-bumper traffic.
I saw two guys on a motorcycle, one car behind me. The passenger got off and put a bunch of cell phones in his pockets. I understood they were coming for me next. They knocked on my windows, and with the guns, one on each side, I gave them everything I had, as everybody else did.
Atsieli is not alone. 9 out of every 10 violent crimes in the city involves the two wheels. Motorcycles are favored by robbers and hitmen, and gangs of armed bikers act with impunity, like these looting a broken-down truck. This driver is one of them. He works as a taxi driver, but says he mugs people when in need.
There are times that you have to. It's like, damn, I've no money and there was little work. Or it rained all week and I couldn't work. You need the money, so you're encouraged to steal. I call a friend, we go look for victims.
The two-wheel invasion began a decade ago, when cheap Chinese-made bikes arrived. They are a problem, but also a lifeline in the constant gridlock. Transportation infrastructure has been neglected for decades, leading to these levels of congestion. Things have become so bad that what's a 30-minute commute on a motorcycle takes more than 2 hours in a car. Sociologist Rafael Ramirez says people know the city wouldn't be viable without them, but wish the government could crack down on the lawlessness.
Right now we live in a situation of anarchy, a total lack of social solidarity. This government has implanted the idea the poor can do what they want. Rules have not been enforced for years, so now even if they try, people defy them.
The government started meeting with associations of bikers, many of which support the socialist ruling party. But getting them to agree to even basic rules might be as difficult as navigating Caracas traffic. Alessandro Ampietti, Al Jazeera, Caracas.